Go, let's import the data from our movies database. First, we'll want to make sure that the movies.db file is inside of our SQLAlcemy workspace folder. Inside of this folder, we'll also create a new file called database.py. This is the Python file we'll use to interact with our already created movies database. To use SQLAlcemy, we'll import SQLAlcemy at the top with import SQLAlcemy. In this example, we'll be using SQLAlcemy Core. It uses the SQL expression language, which can differ a little bit from SQL itself. In the next chapter, we'll get into SQLAlcemy as an ORM, but that can also be used with SQLite. Following this import, we'll write as DB, so we can reference SQLAlcemy as DB throughout this file. The next step is to connect with the database. We can do this by using SQLAlcemy's create engine function. For the database, we'll import SQLite, add 3 slashes, and then the name of our database file. In this case, that's movies.db. If this file did not exist, it would create the file and in turn create the database. But in our case, we've already moved that movies.db file to our workspace, so it'll load in our database. We'll save the result of this function in a variable called engine. Now, this is not the same thing as the Python database API's connection object. The engine allows your application to have multiple database connections, and it manages those connections. From the engine, we can create a connection with which we can run database queries on. To create a connection, we can use the engine's connect method, and then we'll save the result in a variable called connection. This connection is actually a proxy for the true Python database API connection. Next, we'll load our movies table into SQLAlcemy. So we're loading what's in the database into our application. To do this, we'll use db.table. Give it the name of our database, in this case, movies. We'll also pass it some metadata, which we'll set up in a minute. We're going to set autoload equal to true, and we're going to autoload it with our engine. We can retrieve the metadata about our database with db.metadata. And we'll write that just below our connection and save it in a variable called metadata. This metadata will hold all the information about our table. That's why we pass it in to db.table. Since this db.table is our movies table, we'll save it in a variable called movies. Great. With our table loaded, let's make some queries to our movies table. One basic query we can make is one that selects all of the records in the movies table. In SQL, we did select star from movies, but in SQLAlcemy, we can use the select function and give it our table in square brackets. So we'll go db.select and give it our movies table. We'll save it in a variable called query. So this does not actually query the database yet, but it does set up our query that will execute with the connection object. To execute the query, we'll write connection.execute, so accessing that connection, and what do we want to execute? Our query. Now this function returns something called a result proxy. And this result proxy proxies the cursor object from the Python database API. This means we can use the result proxy to retrieve the data. And similar to the cursor, there are a few different ways we can retrieve it. One way is to use fetch all. The resulting data from fetch all is a result set, so we'll save it in a variable called result set. The result set is the actual data. We can interact with it as a list of records and interact with each piece as an object. Let's take a look at a few records. We'll write print result set. We can print out that first record by accessing the first object. And then let's say we want to print a group of records. In this case, I'm going to do :2 to grab the first 2 records that are returned as a part of this result set. I'm going to save this file up, and then we'll run it in our command line. I'll run ls just to make sure we have that database.py file inside of that workspace folder. And then you'll also want to make sure that your virtual environment is activated because that's how we installed SQLAlcemy through pip inside of this virtual environment. With all of that set up, we can run our file. So I'm going to write Python 3 database.py, and look at those records. We have the first record, which is the taxi driver record, and then it also printed out the first two records, which include that same taxi driver record. Let's retrieve all the movies where Martin Scorsese is the director. And SQLAlcemy will add on to our previous query, so I'm just going to copy this. We're going to overwrite that variable, which is fine for practice, and we're going to add on .where, so adding on that conditional, movies.columns.director, so we're accessing that director column in an object-oriented way, and we need that to be equal to Martin Scorsese, because those are the records we want to retrieve. Since this is a more selective query, we're only going to get one result back, the one movie where Martin Scorsese is the director. Of course, we haven't executed it yet. We need to run connection.execute, and we're going to execute this where query, and we're going to save the result again in a result proxy. I'm just going to overwrite this variable to make it easy for us. And then we're going to grab all the results by doing fetch all again on that result proxy. So this will get us the results from that where query. We'll save it up. And we're going to print that first result with result set 0. So that should get that record where Martin Scorsese is the director. Let's run over to our terminal, run it again. It executes those first two queries because we did not comment them out, and we get this same Martin Scorsese again, that same record back in our terminal. All right, so we know how to select records. Let's try inserting a new record. In this case, I'm going to access that movies object. So a little bit different here. We're not using db.select. We're accessing our movies table. We're going to go .insert.values, and we're going to insert Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The title is going to be Psycho. The director is going to be Alfred Hitchcock, and then the year 1960. Of course, this just creates the query. We need to execute it with the database in order to insert the new entry. So we'll create a query object and use the connection to execute the query. We'll write connection.execute and pass in that query. Now, we don't really care about the results of this query because it's an insert. We can, however, select all of the records again and print out the results to ensure our record was added. To do that, we'll create another query. We'll write db.select. We'll select our movies table. We'll make it our query. We'll execute it with connection.execute, passing in the query. We'll save it in a result proxy and then grab the result set from that. Then we'll finally print out all of the entries in our database with that result set. Let's go ahead and run the file. We'll write Python 3 database.py, and we get some data back. This last piece of data is the data we really care about. It has all of the data in our database. It even has our newest entry, which is Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. In this chapter, we switched from using SQLite 3 to SQLAlcemy, but in the real world, you would just pick one for your application. You would decide to use SQLite 3 with queries written in SQL, or you would use SQLAlcemy. Throughout this course, I'll be showing you a little bit of both, so you can understand both options and even pick a different ORM to use.